Salamun alaikum. In many ways, I really feel sorry for people who are missing this series and who will miss it once we are done with it. Inshallah, they will catch up with us and they will watch all the parts in this beautiful series on the story of Yusuf. This segment is part 6 of this series, and inshallah, we're going to start right away. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Again, this is part 6 of the story of Yusuf. The title for this segment is The Brother's First Trip to Misr. Yusuf tries to buy his brother as a slave. Is that true? We're going to find out, inshallah. Remember that this presentation and this whole series is really a series of presentations at the level of a graduate school course. So please take it seriously. This is not for entertainment purposes. Please pay attention. I'm giving a lot of hints, a lot of details, a lot of bayinat that we've used extensively and we will use extensively in the future regarding the methodology that we use. You are expected to work hard, yes. Hopefully you are taking notes and keeping track of all your questions, because the plot, starting with this segment, is starting to become a lot more complex, inshallah, as you will see. In this segment, we have a few reminders to start with, and we're going to cover ayat 58 through 62 of Surah Yusuf, Surah 12. We start with a few reminders. Please do not put the answers of the 8 questions from part 5, which is the last segment, YT98, on the comment stream. Please do not spoil it for other people so that they can keep thinking and reflecting and come up with their own results. In the last part, I had a typo in the address. This is the correct address, marvelousquran@gmail. Please pay attention to the fact that we have the wrong address in the prior segment. Remember that we are skipping over the ayat 21 to 57, and this is on purpose until we finish the story of Yusuf and his siblings. If you remember these ayat, we call them part 2 of the story. We covered 54 to 57 briefly in the last segment. We're going to revisit them again toward the end of part 2 of the story, which is toward the end of this series, this whole series. As I said before, we're probably going to have about 30 segments in this series. So hopefully you are patient, you're taking a lot of notes, you're keeping track of all of these details, and I promise you it'll get easier. And once we unravel the unspoken fact that underlies the whole story, it will make more sense and it will become very, very intriguing and interesting. So the third reminder is that in the ayah 12:15, we read وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْهِ لَتُنَبِّئَنَّهُمْ بِأَمْرِهِمْ هَذَا وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. We enjoined upon him, you are to tell them about this here corrupt undertaking of theirs. Remember, this is at the time where they're taking him away from his father while colluding, while discussing what they're plotting to do with him. And we've talked about al-jub. Go back to the prior segments so that you understand a little bit more of the details. And this is part of the questions that we included in YT98. The point is, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْهِ, we have enjoined upon him, you are to tell them about this same plot at a time when they're not aware, وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ, while they perceive it not. The interpretation of this specific sentence is in this segment right here today, inshallah. Reminder number 4, in ayah 12:10, we had seen غَيَابَةِ الْجُبْ, and I told you last segment that we changed the interpretation, that we changed the translation for that. So this is the full translation for ayah 12:10 based on what we discovered in the last segment, YT98. The translation for ayah 10 goes, a deceiving speaker among them said, do not slay Yusuf and remand him instead, not in the inner ledge of the cistern, but among the long forgotten, cut off slaves. I'm adding this word, changing a little bit again, because this is clarifying. Hopefully you've had a chance to think about it, to reflect on what we discussed regarding al-jub, and this makes perfect sense now. Hopefully you're getting the hint. I don't want to get too graphic. I don't want to get too painful in describing what happened to Yusuf. But all of the indications tell us that this is what happened to him, which is really ironic because it's a totally different story than the story they told us about Yusuf and all the sexual infatuation and all of these details that were confabulated and have nothing to do with the real story from the Quran. So this is the interpretation and the translation of ayah 12:10 if you want to correct the notes that you've already taken. All right, we dive directly into ayah 12:58. وَجَاءَ إِخْوَةُ يُوسُفَ فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ فَعَرَفَهُمْ وَهُمْ لَهُ مُنْكِرُونَ. And later, meaning later in the story, there's clearly a jump in time in telling the timeline of the story. Yusuf's siblings or Yusuf's brothers. I use the word siblings, by the way, because the word ikhwa in Arabic does not necessarily indicate males only. So to be faithful to the text, we say siblings, but we have no indication that there were any girls or women with them. So the translation continues, Yusuf's siblings arrived at Yusuf's location and they entered in conformance with his expectations or rules. This is strange, I know, but I will explain it. You should know by now that I don't introduce anything unless I really explain it and provide the evidence for it. So we're going to explain it. And he recognized them while they were not disposed to recognize him. They were not ready to recognize him. They were not able. They had something that prevented them from recognizing him. وَهُمْ لَهُ مُنْكِرُونَ. We're going to detail it a little bit more, inshallah, in the next few seconds. So the expression وَجَاءَ إِخْوَةُ يُوسُفَ followed by فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ in the text up here in the ayah indicates that there is some extra semantics being relayed, because جاء إخوة يوسف, they came or they arrived, and therefore that meaning is partly in فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ, and they entered upon him. This is how the vast majority of translators translated this specific expression. Here I'm adding more because the Quran is almost begging us to see that there is something more going on. So what's going on? So the expression دَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ is from دَخَلَ عَلَى, it's a phrasal verb, and it really means something more than just to enter upon him. To enter upon him, that means they just opened the door and walked in, or they met with him, or something like that. No, there's something more going on. دَخَلَ عَلَى is the opposite of خَرَجَ عَلَى. And those of you who have been following this channel and all the segments that we've talked about, the story of Zechariah and other stories that we will discuss regarding Qur'an and so on, this verb occurs in these stories to mean he went against them. So kharaja ala, he went against them. He went against their beliefs. He went against their expectations. So dakhala ala is the exact opposite of that. These are two verbs that are opposite of each other. So what does dakhala ala mean? It indicates to enter in conformance with the expectations or with the rules. In other words, kharaja ala is to go out against the conformance and the expectations and the rules. Dakhala ala means to enter in conformance with the expectations and the rules. I told you the Quran has very precise terminology and it gives us additional details with every expression. And therefore here, when we have two sentences that almost mean the same thing, this is not repetition. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is adding semantic value by giving us this expression right here. فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ. فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ, that means Yusuf had certain expectations or certain rules, and therefore they entered to meet with him in conformance to those rules. The important thing is this ayah is telling us that Yusuf was setting some rules, was establishing some expectations, was sort of in charge of something. He had some governance role. He had some leadership role of some sort where they had to comply with what he set as far as the rules are concerned. So now we understand that they came as part of an interview or part of a vetting process. Perhaps that Yusuf was checking all of these new groups coming to trade in the marketplace. They had to be vetted to make sure that they are complying with the laws of the kingdom, so to speak, laws of the king. More importantly, based on what we saw in YT98, Yusuf was in charge of the secret intelligence apparatus for the king, working on behalf of the king, and therefore he was making sure that the provisions or whatever they're trading is not benefiting the enemies of the king, the outside opponents of the king. I hope this makes sense. So now we're getting this implication or this ayah or this sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, A, Yussuf is in a high position to set some rules and to set some expectations. B, whoever was coming to trade, and this group was new, coming in for the first time, obviously, they had to fulfill certain expectations. All of these meanings are part of these two words right here. I hope you're impressed. The Quran is full of semantics, full of information in every sentence, in every word, in every expression. So therefore, we should not skip forward quickly. So if you look at all the interpretations and the translations, they skip over this as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not say anything. He just entered upon Yussuf. No, there's a lot more going on. So let's see a little bit more about dakhalu alayhi. Dakhalu alayhi, from the simpler form of the phrasal verb dakhala ala, is used in Ali Imran, ayah 337. In the story of Zakaria, we saw this. كُلَّمَا دَخَلَ عَلَيْهَا زَكَرِيَّا الْمِحْرَابِ, talking about Zakaria going in to meet or to study or to review certain things with Maryam. Pay attention how beautiful this is, because this is adding a new layer of semantics to the story of Zakaria and Maryam. I told you that Zakaria dealt with Maryam with utmost respect and utmost love and appreciation of her human being. She was not just any woman. She was not just a lowly student or a lowly girl working under him. No, she was somebody very important, and he respected that. This gives us more appreciation for that beautiful, tender relationship between Zakaria and Maryam. Remember, this was before he even had any thought that he might have children or children with her specifically, as we discussed in the series of Isa ibn Maryam. Here, this ayah, كُلَّمَا دَخَلَ عَلَيْهَا, the translation is, every time he entered to meet with her, in conformance with her expectations. It's absolutely beautiful. That means he was providing her full respect and dignity. It's amazing how beautiful the Quran is if we pay attention to every single detail. Here's another example from ayah 1323 from Surah Ar-Ra'd. This is discussing the people in Jannah. وَالْمَلَائِكَةُ يَدْخُلُونَ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ كُلِّ بَابٍ. Al-Malaika, the angels, enter upon them. Well, it doesn't give us a lot of information if we say this, but if we use this interpretation right here, they enter in conformance with their expectations and their rules or their understanding. Remember, the angels, when they give you any kind of abrogation or repair of your Weltanschauung, it is in conformance to your own expectations. It is in conformance to what you're looking for. So if you enter into the interpretation of the scripture with the wrong assumptions, the angels are going to give you what you're looking for, what your expectations are. يَدْخُلُونَ عَلَيْهِمْ. They give you in conformance with your expectations. Absolutely beautiful. It fits, it matches everything we have said so far about how the angels and the Arsh and the Kursi all work together beautifully to conform your own biases. So if you entered with the biases, guess what happens? The angels will give you according to those biases. Of course, the people of Jannah have controlled some of these biases. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send the angels, and the angels give you in conformance to your beautiful expectations. So if you enter with an empty cup, they will fill it. They will help you understand new information, fresh water, fresh divine rain from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as you expected. If you entered with your cup half full, they will help you fill it based on your expectations. And if you enter with a full cup, they won't give you anything. In other words, they enter according to your expectations, exactly the meaning that we're talking about. Min kulli bab, from every point of view, from every perspective. So they will help you from different points of view to see the truth from different facets, from different angles, so to speak. Again, absolutely stunning and beautiful, and conforms everything that we're seeing so far. So this is the interpretation of dakhala ala, which is the opposite of kharaja ala. You didn't think that this simple word right here has so much information and so much knowledge in the Quran, did you? This is the Quran. This is the engaging of the Quran. It allows us to swim in all of these meanings, in all of these beautiful type of understanding layers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to have access to. All right, so we go back to فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ. That means Yussuf was setting the rules for monitoring those who receive trade at the market, as I said a little earlier. We will return to this issue even more when we discuss the brothers' second trip to Misr. This is going to become a lot more relevant later. I promise you this story is going to become more and more complex as we go. Now, the term munkirun, wahum lahu munkirun, and they were not disposed to recognize him. Why did I say they were not disposed to recognize him? Because this word right here, munkirun, is the plural of munkir, which is an active participle. So what is that? That's the noun that represents persistence over time. That is, they had some sort of problem that prevented them from even recognizing him. So they were liable to not recognize him. So they had some assumptions in their mind. They had some recognitions that did not match what they're looking at. Yussuf was right in front of them and they could not recognize him. Why? In scientific cognitive psychology, this is called confirmation bias. There's a funny story about a person losing the key, and then you enter into a room and saying to yourself, I did not lose it in this room, but I'm going to look for the keys here. Guess what? You're not going to find it in that room, even if you had lost it there, because you already started with an assumption that it's not there. That's called confirmation bias. This is part of cognitive psychology. So in this case, the Quran is referring to confirmation bias. For whom? For the brothers, for the siblings. So what's going on? We will understand more when we discover the unspoken fact that I keep talking about that really underlies the whole story. They were expecting something about Yussuf, and what they saw in front of them did not match that expectation at all. And therefore, they didn't question their assumptions. Does that remind you of someone? Does that remind you of 99.99% of the Muslims, or at least those who are attacking this channel? They have some bad assumptions they can't get rid of. They have no justification for these assumptions, and still they insist that these assumptions are true, which prevents them from understanding the truth. This is called confirmation bias. In this case, it's a negative bias. It's a bias that prevents you from seeing the truth. In this case, it's very obvious. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us using the active participle, a noun, not a verb. So in here, فَعَرَفَهُمْ is a verb. Yussuf immediately recognized them. It's a verb, one time. But they are in a persistent state of not being able to recognize him. Why? As I said, we will see in the future very soon, inshallah. Now we move to ayah number 59 of this surah. وَلَمَّا جَهَّزَهُمْ بِجَهَازِهِمْ قَالَ ائْتُونِي بِأَخٍ لَكُمْ مِنْ أَبِيكُمْ أَلَا تَرَوْنَ أَنِّي أُوفِي الْكَيْلَ وَأَنَا خَيْرُ الْمُنْزِلِينَ. And after he provided them what they needed, readied them or helped them get ready with whatever they needed to get ready for the trip. We will come back to this expression in just a few seconds. قَالَ ائْتُونِي بِأَخٍ لَكُمْ. He said, bring me a brother of yours from your father. Do you not see that I fulfill the conditions of trade and that I am the best of hosts? There's a lot to unpack in here. We're going to take it slowly and discuss it one piece at a time. So as we see, جَهَّزَهُمْ بِجَهَازِهِمْ, the expression includes two terms, two words from the same root. And I told you this is a bayina. In an earlier segment, we've talked about this a little bit. So there is some scheming going on. Scheming by whom? Scheming by the subject of this verb, جَهَّزَهُمْ, which is Yussuf. So Yussuf is plotting something, is preparing something. This is the first hint. Immediately we recognize there's some plot going on. There's something more than meets the eye, more than the superficial layer that we're reading. قَالَ ائْتُونِي بِأَخٍ لَكُمْ مِنْ أَبِيكُمْ. Bring a brother of yours from your father. We're going to find out a little bit later how he came to that conclusion. أَلَا تَرَوْنَ أَنِّي أُوفِي الْكَيْلَ. Don't you see that I fulfill the conditions of trade? Which proves that he already fulfilled the conditions of trade. They came to trade, they bought something, he gave them in exchange what they wanted to buy, so it's completed, that transaction is completed, and this is what he's saying. Don't you already see that I am fair, that I fulfill the conditions of trade, and that I am the best of hosts? So, وَأَنَا خَيْرُ الْمُنْزِلِينَ. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us through the words of Yussuf that Yussuf not only provided them their trade in full, but also he provided them their accommodations. He provided accommodations for them. Yes, this indicates he was monitoring them. I told you there is a plot or a scheme going on in here. And this is how we understand it, by scanning and really parsing every word and every character in this sentence so that we understand it in full. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us all of this rich amount of detail in this sentence. Now, one more thing we need to understand is Yussuf said, أَخٍ لَكُم مِّنْ أَبِيكُمْ. He tells us that all the siblings were from the same father. أَبِيكُم, one father to all of you. Right away, this is an indication. We saw that they referred to themselves as Usbah. Is this possibly why Yussuf and his brother, the younger brother that we will see soon, was a different clique? Possible. This is a hint. This is an ayah, a sign. We don't have clear details yet. We don't want to jump into the conclusion to say that Yussuf and his younger brother were from a different mother. But clearly here there is something going on. However, it's really not totally relevant to the story. It was enough for us to see وَنَحْنُ عُصْبَةٌ mentioned twice in the earlier parts that we saw in this surah. Here, this is a confirmation. This is an explanation. We will continue. We're parsing and learning and extracting knowledge and information as we go. The second piece of information we extract from this sentence right here, أَخٍ لَكُم مِّنْ أَبِيكُمْ, is that Yussuf wanted to verify that the younger brother was still around and that his father was still alive. Remember, he has been gone for a long time. This is the first time he sees his brothers after a while, many, many years, as we will see. So therefore, he didn't know anything about his father or his younger brother. What was he worried about as far as the younger brother is concerned? He was worried that they did the same thing as they did to himself, Yussuf. How about the father? He wasn't sure the father was still alive. So how would he check? He asked them that question. He asked them that question. When he got the answer, the positive answer from them, he knew two things. The younger brother is still with Yaqub, and Yaqub was still alive. I hope you appreciate how we extract all of these beautiful clues and hints and how the story plot is progressing one step at a time. So instead of Allah telling us that Yaqub was still alive and the younger brother was still with him, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put it as part of a weaved plot, as we see, a discourse, a conversation where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is allowing us to extract all of these beautiful nuggets, all of this beautiful information. I told you this story is so magnificent and complex and amazing in its quality and eloquence. Now, as I said before, the expression أَلَا تَرَوْنَ أَنِّي أُوفِي الْكَيْلِ indicates that he already provided them their trade in full. This is going to become very relevant to understand the next few ayat, especially the next segment. وَأَنَا خَيْرُ الْمُنزِلِينَ. I told you that he provided them accommodation, which indicates that he wanted to monitor them. This is probably how he found out enough information to ask to purchase the younger brother from the same father. Therefore, now we know that there was some background, that they stayed in a house that he offered them, and therefore he chatted with them and conversed with them and extracted all sorts of information before making that request from them. So that request did not come from thin air. We are given enough information, especially about being the best of hosts. Now, one last comment here. The word munzilin relates to every time we read in the Quran, anzala. Remember, I used the verb lodged or made it housed in, providing residence, providing a container where some information is contained within this housing. This is the munzilin, the anzala, the meaning of the verb anzala al-Qur'an. Inna anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyan. We lodged it in a Quran that is consonanted. Remember, we talked about this. All right, so now we move to ayah number 60 from Surah Yusuf, Surah 12. فَإِن لَمْ تَأْتُونِي بِهِ فَلَا كَيْلَ لَكُمْ عِنْدِي وَلَا تَقْرَبُونَ. And thus, if you don't bring him, meaning the younger brother, to me, you shall not receive any trade from me in the future, and you shall not be allowed to even come near me again. So this is very strong language. This is very important to understand. And this confirms that Yussuf was setting the rules. Was he in a position to apply these rules? Obviously, he was in a position to apply these rules, as we saw a little earlier. And that's why فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ. دَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ, according or in conformance to his rules, makes perfect sense. He is able to dictate the instructions or the rules or the conditions for future trade. I hope this is making a lot of sense to you, because it's all right there in front of our eyes, and we're extracting all of this knowledge from every word in every ayah. Let's parse it a little bit further and learn more. The expression ta'tuni bihi indicates that the young brother is not with them. Obviously, the younger brother that he was asking for is not with them. We explained the importance of this phrasal verb ata bi, with the letter ba following the verb ata, in YT67. This is extremely important. We're going to see how significant it is to understand the later part of part 1 of this story. So I hope if you have not seen YT67, you take this opportunity. Please go back and revisit YT67. It will benefit you a lot. The expression وَلَا تَقْرَبُونَ clearly refers to the future, which shows that the trade was already completed during the first trip. Again, this is significant information. So now we ask, what was compelling Yussuf to ask for his younger brother? The obvious answer is to safeguard his younger brother from what happened to him. As we saw at the top of this segment, we saw that لَتُنَبِّئَنَّهُمْ بِأَمْرِهِمْ هَذَا وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. You shall tell them about the same plot or the same corrupt undertaking at a time where they don't sense it or they don't feel it or perceive it. This is the time. This is the plot. This is جَهَّزَهُمْ بِجَهَازِهِمْ. He was plotting in fulfillment of the enjoinment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him at the time they were walking away with him and plotting as to what to do with him. By the way, the traditional story never explains that aspect of that ayah. لَتُنَبِّئَنَّهُمْ بِأَمْرِهِمْ هَذَا وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. This is the clear interpretation of that part of that story. But there is more. Yussuf wanted to compel his father to come with them. To come with them where? To come with them to Misr. Because he was counting or hoping that Yaqub will not let the younger brother go alone with them. As we will see, Yussuf miscalculated and Yaqub decided to do something totally different. We will see inshallah in the next few segments. So now we move to ayah number 61 in this surah. قالوا سنراود عنه أباه وإنا لفاعلون. The siblings said to each other in private, obviously, we shall compel his father into parting with him, and certainly we shall act according to a plan. I've discussed a little bit of this in the past, but here we're going to see in a lot more detail what this plan that they developed is all about. This is going to come in the next few ayat. As I keep telling you, the challenge with this surah is that the evidence always comes later. So it is the ultimate in training us about the sunk cost bias, and therefore we have to be patient. Every time we read something, we should expect that it's coming in a few ayat later or maybe further down in the surah. As we will see, سَنُرَاوِدُ عَنْهُ أَبَاهُ, we shall force or compel or corner his father to make that decision that is favorable to what we want. What did they want? They wanted to do what Yussuf asked them for, to bring the younger brother and sell him as a slave. Basically, this is what Yussuf was saying. So he was talking about a trade, meaning trading money for the younger brother. Yussuf was also talking about housing him. وَأَنَا خَيْرُ الْمُنزِلِينَ. I'm the best host. He will host him in his own residence, which confirms that Yussuf provided residence to the siblings, to the brothers. While he did this, he was monitoring them, and he figured out exactly what they did and what they said. So this confirms a lot of details. A lot of details now are matching against each other and confirming one another. And we will continue inshallah. The exact evidence for this shall become clear in ayah 1263. The discourse was not said in Yussuf's presence clearly, and yet we're going to find out Yussuf decided to do something about it when he learned what they just said in here. So they said to each other, we shall compel his father into parting with him, meaning the younger brother, and certainly we shall act in accordance to a plan. So now we move to ayah 1262. وَقَالَ لِفِتْيَانِهِ جَعَلُوا بِضَاعَتَهُمْ فِي رِحَالِهِمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَعْرِفُونَهَا إِذَا انْقَلَبُوا إِلَى أَهْلِهِمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ. And he, Yussuf, said to his servant young men, I told you there were fityan, and therefore in the prior segment when we saw the king addressing people, telling them those who are looking for the diligent work will get their reward later. That's what he was talking about. So there was fityan, servants, given to Yussuf to work under him, to work under his organization. He was gathering information for the purposes of protecting the state security, the security of the state run by the king. And we're going to see Yussuf had an admiration and respect for the laws of the king. And that's partly because Yussuf was his advisor, but more importantly, because the king himself was a good person, and we will see. So he said to his young man, servant young man, conceal their stock and trade property within their personal travel packs, rihalihim. Perhaps they recognize it, meaning the concealed property. This is the property they brought to trade, so it's referred to as stock and trade. Perhaps they recognize it after they arrive at their household. How did he know that that's going to happen? Because he was one of them and he knew their habits. He knew how things worked in that household. So he knew that if he hid it in a certain place, they would not open it until they reach home. The ayah continues, and perhaps they returned. They returned here to Misr for more trade with the younger brother in a future trip. That was his hope. This is exactly what he wanted them to do. So why did he include their stock and trade back to them, give them back their stock and trade? The answer is because he was worried they may not have enough stock and trade or possessions to come back for a second trip and get some more trade done. So he wanted to entice them and to encourage them to come back and complete the transaction with his brother. Remember, he told them, if you don't bring your brother, don't ever come back here again. So that was a really important condition he put on them, which means if he gave them back their possessions, their stock and trade, they will be very highly likely to come back with the younger brother in order to complete the trade. So how do we know that bida'atahum indicates stock and trade? The answer is because in ayah 12:19 we saw وَأَسَرُّوهُ بِضَاعَةً indicates concealed him to be with other property as their stock and trade. And therefore, we already have some linguistic definitions given in the same surah. أَسَرُّوهُ بِضَاعَةً, their stock and trade, that was the caravan of travelers, remember, those who bought Yussuf to sell him as a slave. So they considered him bida'a, stock and trade. So the same word is used in here, which is the stuff that they brought to trade for something else. Now notice the expression اجعلوا بضاعتهم في رحالهم, which is part of this ayah right here. اجعلوا بضاعتهم في رحالهم. I told you the verb اجعلوا includes the concept of concealment or putting something within something else. This is to hide within. This is where I got it from. So the verb ja'ala in the Quran is not just to make, but to make something within something else. There is a group or some hiding or concealment or some sort of tucking in, embedding, so to speak. That concept must always be there as we interpret the verb ja'ala. Always, probably not always, but almost always. So we have to keep that concept in mind because clearly it's used in this story to refer to hiding something within or placing something within or making or changing the nature of something to make it part of something else. Now we go to another linguistic note in here. Notice that the referent to the pronoun hum in لَعَلَّهُمْ, let me go back to the ayah so you see it. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَعْرِفُونَهَا إِذَا انْقَلَبُوا إِلَىٰ أَهْلِهِمْ. لَعَلَّهُمْ in here, لَعَلَّهُمْ, is it talking about the brothers or is it talking about somebody else? In this case, as we will see again coming down the rest of this surah, the people who discover it are the family, the household, not the brothers. He wanted to hide it from the brothers. That's why he put it hidden in the travel packs. So that means لَعَلَّهُمْ يَعْرِفُونَهَا is not referring to the brothers, but whoever opens the travel packs back at the household. So who are they? The word is أهلهم, their household. Their household is what's referred to as the referent in the word لَعَلَّهُمْ, which means the referent for the pronoun hum, please pay attention, the referent for the pronoun hum is not given until after the pronoun is used. لعلهم يعرفونها إذا انقلبوا إلى أهلهم. أهلهم are the hum in لعلهم. They are the ones who would discover it. And Yusuf knew that from their prior habits. So therefore, this is another indication that the Quran has no problem going against or changing the rules of the Arab poets of the 7th century. And this is what we discussed in full details in YT93. Please refer back to that segment for a lot more information. This is just a passing linguistic note. Again, everything we're seeing, everything we're reading plays to support one another, buttresses everything we've discovered so far. So the Quran is fully congruent, supports one another, it's fully interlinked. Nothing is running away by itself without being a janah or a supporting evidence for something else. And finally, notice that Yusuf was not using Abrahamic locution with his servant young men. Because I know some of you are going to say, Ahl, we interpret it to mean cohort. Yes, it does in Abrahamic locution. The question is, Yusuf was talking to whom? He was talking to his servant young men. Was Yusuf's usage of the Abrahamic locution important for the fityan, the young men? And the answer is no. There's no need for that. And we saw this in the case of how to circumcise a she-cow. We discussed how two different groups may be using the Abrahamic locution or not, depending on the context and on the circumstances. And this is exactly another application for it. So in this case, Yusuf was not really using Abrahamic locution. He was talking to them in their language. And in their language, the superficial language, so to speak, which happens to be matching the traditional Arab's understanding of the word Ahl. Ahl means family or clan or something like this, not the Abrahamic locution. The Abrahamic locution, Ahl means cohorts. I hope this makes perfect sense. So with this, we move to some closing remarks. Please pay attention because they are really important. First, there is absolutely no evidence of granaries. Did you hear anywhere in the Quran, anywhere that Yusuf was in charge of granaries or the stockpiles of grains after the 7 years of famine and all of this stuff? Absolutely not. And don't tell me you know this from the part that we skipped over, because when we go to that, you will see it's not there neither. So there is absolutely no mention of granaries. Where did that come from? How did it get into our books of tafsir? You guessed it. It came from the corrupted versions of the earlier scriptures, of the Torah specifically. In that story, there are granaries and droughts and 7 years of famine and all of this stuff. In this story, which is in the Quran, it is not mentioned at all. I know you're going to tell me in the report about Sanabil and so on and so forth. It's not what you think. We will see, inshallah. The second note here is, notice that there's no evidence that the younger brother was named Benjamin or Benyamin. So don't use that word. That is not a Quranic name. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give that name to this younger boy. By the way, we're only assuming that he's a younger boy because Yusuf was caring about him and he's thinking that after him, he's gonna see the same possible plot from the siblings. So in all likelihood, he's a younger brother. Not necessarily, but this is the best assumption we can make. So we don't need that, but to simplify the story and to refer to that other brother, we refer to him as the younger brother. It is not really essential to understand the whole story. We need to know only that the siblings, the brothers, could have done the same thing to the other boy, the other brother, the younger one, so to speak, just as they did to Yusuf. So that's why we refer to him as the younger brother. Also notice that there's no mention of famine or starvation. This is not mentioned anywhere. And don't tell me that is in the report by the king. As we will see, that's not there. It's talking about something totally different, and we will dissect it and parse it and really provide all the details when we get to it. But for now, they came not really asking for grains, not really asking for something to help them from the famine or starvation. It's not part of their first trip at all. Wasn't mentioned anywhere in those ayats that describe the first trip. However, it is possible that Yaqub's clan were suffering some sort of drought back in his homestead. Possible, because they're nomads, they're shepherds. So drought would have pushed them to lose their flocks, probably, maybe, force them to trade some of their possessions for food. Possible, but it's not really mentioned in the Quran, and nor is it really that important as far as the story is concerned, and you will see. However, it is also possible that the siblings have done something corrupt that caused them to lose all their flocks. It is possible, as we saw, the siblings are treacherous and deviant and have done many bad things in the past, so it is possible that they were forced Yaqub to sell some of his possessions in exchange for some provisions to feed the family. So now we ask a very important question. Why did Yussuf give them back their stock in trade? I've explained this already a little bit, but let's go over it just to make sure to cement all of these concepts in our minds. First, it is to ensure that they return with the younger brother. Remember, the younger brother is something I'm added just to identify, just to distinguish between all of these different characters. It's not necessarily essential to the story per se. In case they did not have enough to trade, he was worried that they may not be able to return to trade even if they wanted to. Even if they wanted to bring the younger brother, the father would not see any benefit to that. So he gave them their stock in trade to entice them to come back and to incite them, to cause them to think possibly in a negative way, which is exactly what he wanted them to do and expecting them to do. And that's exactly what happened. Was this ethical of Yussuf? We will see. We will ask this question coming soon. What else? This was a secret message to his father. He knew that his father would be able to find this out after they arrived to their homestead. What else? It was hidden to force the brother's hand in confessing to their father as much details as possible. He knew that they're going to do something corrupt on the way back. And therefore, when they got back, they're going to make up some story. But he wanted to have some surprise element they did not count on that will force their hand to confess to some of their crimes. And this is exactly what happened, as we will see in the next segment. As we said before, we will see that Yussuf knew what they were planning to do even before they left Misr. Why? Because he provided them the accommodation, and in all likelihood, he was able to understand what they were saying or to spy on them. And that's exactly how he learned what they were planning to do. And therefore, he reacted by putting their stock in trade in their travel packs without them knowing it. Why did Yussuf want to bring his younger brother? This answer should be really obvious, because something horrible, unspeakable has happened to him already, and he did not want his younger brother to suffer the same thing. Now, we close with this ethical question. Was Yussuf justified in trying to buy his brother as a slave, even as part of a plot? Meaning, he did not really intend for him to be a slave, but he ran the risk of them doing something to that young boy, the young brother. Was it ethical? The answer is absolutely not. And we're going to see that Ayah 76, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us clearly he was not supposed to do this. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala altered the plan to the same results, to have the younger brother stay with Yussuf without this unethical behavior. In other words, Yussuf was trying to bend the laws a little bit. More importantly, we're going to see that this is evidence against slavery itself. Against slavery, yes, against slavery. So the Quran is telling us clearly, you should not do this. And yet, unfortunately, the books of tafsir twisted all sorts of ayats to allow for that possibility. And we've lived for almost 1,200, 1,300 years with people defending slavery in the name of Islam. I hope you accept what I say. I declare myself innocent of what they have done. I declare myself having nothing to do in support of their erroneous claims. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to change our ummah, to learn the truth of the Qur'an and reject everything wrong they had taught us in those books that were written by people we don't know. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open our hearts, open our minds, so that we continue learning from this beautiful surah that is complex and sophisticated and full of insight and wisdom. And we close with the dua. Alhamdulillah alladhi hadana lihada wa ma kunna linahtadiya lawla an hadana Allah laqad ja'at rusulu rabbina bil haqq. Thank you very much for watching. Salamun alaykum.